The dark art of budget PCs is a pathway to builds some consider to be unnatural. Tricking out an Optiplex with rainbow LEDs and sparkly gold vinyl doesn't hide the fact that it's rocking a sandy bridge that's old enough to hold a job in some states and an RX 6400 that's slowly choking to death. That doesn't mean that upgrading old pre-builts isn't the key to unlocking budget gaming goodness, it just means you might have to dream a little bigger. I really like my Lenovo P500, and you might wonder why. For about £100 it came with a very basic quad-core Haswell and a pretty much obsolete Quadro K4000. I'll admit, for the price it doesn't look all that exciting compared to a cheaper Optiplex, but the reason I wax lyrical about these old workstations over the more common desktop models is for their expandability. Whereas a cheap desktop from this era would top out at 4 cores and 8 threads, the CPU in these behemoths can be replaced with any number of Xeon E5 V3s from 6 cores up to 22, and you don't even have to spend a fortune to do so. There's plenty of potential for a pretty serious GPU upgrade too, with room for longer 2 and even 3 slot cards, and no need to limit yourself to half-height cards like with some micro towers. The P500 itself is just one of a number of these 2014 to 2016 era workstations with the Intel 2011 V3 socket, with alternative options including the Dell T5810 and HP Z440. Each of these workstations has their own quirks. On the inside, they're often extremely user-friendly with tool-less designs, engraved instructions to help with servicing, and even a simple mechanism for taking the side panel off, which is all very confusing when you consider how much of the stuff in here is proprietary. Of the 3 models I mentioned, not one of them uses a conventional ATX power supply, so you have to be careful to check how many PCIe power connectors it has before you go researching GPU upgrades. That being said, the nature of the way businesses lease these workstations means that in some parts of the world and at certain times of year, you can pick them up for extremely compelling prices and get them set up for gaming with relative ease. It only takes a couple of inexpensive, easy-to-find upgrades to turn this otherwise fairly vanilla box into a bargain 1080p gaming PC. For a mere £9, I upgraded the quad-core to a 6-core 12-thread E5 1650 V3, which has higher boost frequencies and a larger L3 cache than the old chip, and could even be overclocked if the motherboard were capable of it. I've also ditched the included Quadro and installed the GTX 1650 Super, which can be picked up for under £100 and powered with a single 6-pin connector. This last point is actually why I chose this particular card. While some variants of the P500 come with 2 6-pins, which can be adapted into an 8-pin fairly easily, mine only has a single one, and I didn't want to resort to a janky adapter setup again. The best alternative would be the GTX 1066GB, which is also available in 6-pin variants, or you could look at a bus-powered alternative like the RTX A2000, though that one might be a little pricey for a build like this. You could consider the aforementioned RX 6400, however its 4 PCIe data lanes might cause a bottleneck in some games when used with a Gen 3 system like this one. With a little over £200 invested, I'm about ready to play some games. However, as I've already looked at both the Xeon 1650 V3 and the GTX 1650 Super in their own videos, and established how they're holding up in the latest demanding titles, I didn't want to retread any old ground, so I picked a bunch of modern classics instead. If you're curious about how these components fare in my usual test suite, I'll have those videos linked in the description. Doom Eternal is one of the few single-player games I feel demands a high refresh experience to get the most out of it, but it actually doesn't need a modern high-end beast to achieve it. The combination of 1650 V3 and 1650 Super can deliver almost 120 FPS at 1080p medium settings with lows of 75. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a bit more demanding, and you're not going to see a high refresh experience, but it's a Wild West simulator. You're hunting wildlife, not demons from hell. The game can be pretty demanding on CPUs as well as GPUs, but thankfully the Xeon seems up to the challenge, and with the slider nudged over to the lowest of the prioritized quality settings, the average in Saint Denis runs up into the mid-60s and lows only drop as far as 50 FPS, and the game still looks pretty stunning. Horizon Zero Dawn was a flagship title for the PS4 Pro, and despite this PC costing only slightly more than a used console from this era, we actually have a little more performance to work with. The downside though is VRAM, as the 1650 Super's 4GB frame buffer means going above the original preset isn't going to happen. I also had a bit of a weird moment with the built-in benchmark, which I think I'm going to blame on the hard drive. Seriously, we're spoiled with SSDs these days. God of War's another one that escaped from Sony's walled garden and came out looking pretty good. Despite its AMD-based origins, it runs very well on Nvidia and Intel hardware too. However, it also teeters on the edge of the VRAM limit at the original quality presets. My usual test run comes in at pretty much bang on 60 FPS, with lows a little below 50, but carrying on into the first fight with Baldur sees significant drops into the 40s. As a 2015 release, The Witcher 3 can potentially run on some much lower end hardware than this by choosing the classic version. However, as I have a pretty modern GPU installed, I thought it was worth trying out the newly enhanced DX12 version from the end of 2022. Well, that would prove to be a mistake. Even at 1080p medium, the average can only just struggle past 30 FPS, and I think FSR or XeSS would be necessary to even get a 30 lock. I think downgrading the game might be the best solution here. Elden Ring was the only game I tested that suffered from a CPU limit. Evidently, the 1650 V3 wasn't quite up to the task out of the box. To my knowledge, there's no way of implementing the old turbo unlock mod on the P500, and the only method I haven't tried yet is to directly reprogram the BIOS chip. Partly because I don't own a programmer, but mainly because I'm a coward. Anyway, the best I could do was download Inspector, a tool for disabling the Spectre and Meltdown protections on older Intel CPUs, which leaves them vulnerable to attack, but can dramatically improve CPU performance. It worked, but didn't quite get me as far as the 60 FPS cap. The average of 57 feels pretty generous, as I recall seeing frames drop into the 40s pretty often. Overwatch 2 usually gets reserved for my mini PC reviews due to its low system requirements. However, the flip side of being a highly optimized game with low requirements is that a system like this one can run it like a demon. Even at 1080p Ultra, this PC can run at nearly 100 FPS, and there's room to go even higher simply by dropping settings, as the CPU should be good for at least 120 FPS. It always pains me to run battle royales at low resolutions, so it's nice to have Apex Legends running on a real PC for a change. At 1080p high, this setup can run Apex at about 100 FPS on average, and the game looks pretty fantastic at these settings too. Finally, the classic. GTA 5 is practically a low-spec game by modern standards, despite still looking pretty decent at normal settings, and having some quality sliders that can still wreck lower-performance modern PCs. As it turns out, this one is borderline. At 1080p very high, with advanced settings turned up, I saw about 66 FPS on average with lows in the mid-40s. If you're a regular to the channel, you might have already seen the last video I made with the Lenovo P500. That version was a little, jankier than this one. I used a bunch of adapters to turn it into a Series S console killer for only a little more money than this. If you haven't seen that video yet, or the original out-of-the-box video where I tested it with some older games that are way less disappointing than modern ones, they're both linked in the description. I also have another £200 build in the works, this time one that's a little more bespoke, and that video should be out in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.